All right, so today we're talking, we're kind of switching from some of this history stuff. We'll continue talking through history, but we're up to the point in history now, early 1900s, where we left the discussion last time, that we can start talking about, what are the wilderness management principles for today that'll set us up directly for what specific plans we're going to lay out for. It's never just the wilderness, right? It's always the encompassing national forest around it, or park, or wildlife refuge, or whatever. And it all has to be in concert with that. So a couple of our principles are going to deal with that and just help us, locate our management plans in the right kind of space and time scale. And then that's pretty much gonna eliminate the burden of decision fatigue. It's gonna remove a lot of choices that we have to otherwise make in management for a national forest, national park. There's a very specific subset of stuff that we can and have to use or avoid using specifically in wilderness. So it's kind of nice when you're faced with these 25-year size question marks of, okay, now what? Avoiding that decision fatigue is super, super, super valuable. So let's go through a couple of principles. And these are from wilderness.net. And a couple of guys named Hendee and Dawson that have been researching wilderness specifically for a long time, up until recently. And the Forest Service contributes with wilderness.net. I'm sure the Park Service does, but I'm less aware of that and stuff like that. And as we get into the later history of wilderness stuff in the middle of the 1900s, we'll see how the Forest Service is really kind of beautifully underwriting the whole thing. Roosevelt
shit, you know what I mean? Like, is he forefronting this? Or is this Henry David?
This is a little bit after Roosevelt that I'm thinking here, but we'll get into that probably another day. Probably not today.
Go off that. I was just trying to get the time frame I had. Sorry, man. Baby, I know I'm good, dude. You can't afford my goodness. I'm so good, even the Vegas hookers are paying me. You know why? They call a Navy guy, right? You and snorkels.
These class recordings got us.
Oh, he's not recording. That's why I didn't say. That's why I've been talking shit.
I am recording.
Oh,
So our first principle is a decision fatigue removal thing. This is what we'd call an algorithm. An algorithm is a system for making choices.
Right, but who writes the algorithm? Is it man-made or is it through a machine?
So these are principles that sort of come out of how people read the Wilderness Act and are like, okay, so that all sounds great, but what do we actually do?
Okay.
So this kind of supersets on top of the Wilderness Act. So none of this stuff we're about to go through contradicts that. It sort of explains it and operationalizes it would be the fancy technical term. All right. So first, manage wilderness at the pristine extreme. So if you have a set of choices on what you might do with a parcel, or a wilderness study area that may be someday included as a wilderness, formally and federally designated. Whatever the management question, the answer has to sort of skew towards that pristine extreme. Because we've already got recreation areas, we've already got national forests, we've got everything else to cover the whole rest of that management spectrum for forested lands. And wilderness is carving out the space at the pristine extreme. So whatever the choice is, do we do X burn schedule or Y burn schedule, or X burn frequency, Y burn frequency, whichever brings it back to the most natural fire regime, that's the answer. And so you don't have to choose. You still got to figure out whatever that interval is, every 5 years, 25 years, whatever. That's fine. But this simplifies things. It makes our way forward a little bit straighter, right? So whatever the most pristine example or answer is to whatever your wilderness management question is, that's what you're doing. John?
Backing off of the class from last year and this year, what you said, are we trying to get this wilderness to the Native American times? Is that the whole goal? Like, what's the goal here? Like, what are we trying to get the wilderness to? Like, what's
that
it?
is,
Because certain areas are different, correct? I don't mean to think, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, you're right.
That's an over specification, right? So pre-Columbian, right? Pre-white man.
Is that the goal?
That's actually not the goal.
Okay. 'Cause
It
I
was
assume that
for a while as ecologists and foresters try to figure out, okay, we're supposed to make it wild. What does that actually mean? Some people
Right.
said, okay, let's try pre-Columbian. Other folks are like, and especially as we learn more about, First Nations land management practices before Columbus and stuff like that, that's not necessarily the answer for wild areas. So some of these other principles are going to help us explain this a little bit more. So put a pin in that question. We're coming right back to it. All right. 2, we need to manage wilderness comprehensively. Text gets smaller as I get closer and start running out of space. All right, so the idea here is when we're looking at wilderness areas, in contrast to how we look at and definitely how we manage national forests, national parks, and stuff like that, we're not breaking them into districts or units for the Park Service, districts on the forest. We're looking at the whole thing as a unit, even if it's enormous. Right? Now, we might still break it into smaller compartments like at Denali for you get this compartment for a week for backpacking, somebody else gets this next compartment for a week for their backpacking, but it's all managed under the same set of practices. The whole thing is integral. It's all together as one. Question?
Kind of, so,
Yeah.
but and we talked about this again, different slopes and different aspects are different to manage for. You have different waterways coming.
Right.
So you can't manage it as a whole, as you were saying, you break it down into sections. Is that how they're going about, management per se? Let's say Denali, I've never been there, I'm assuming you have, but is
It's
that
got
how-
extreme slope changes, right? So the Alaska Range has the highest peak in North America. It's got its own weather system around Denali.
Right.
It's a 21,000 foot peak. It's basically poking up into the stratosphere. So in that way, we're not, I hear what you're asking. We're not breaking it down all right, we're gonna manage the west slope this way and the east slope that way because one's the wet side, one's the dry side, right? Rain shadow effect.
Kind of, yeah, that's what I was going with that.
We're not doing that. We're zooming out, right?
Okay, so bigger
So,
whole thing.
yeah, the sense here is wild is, it will become defined later on in these principles, but wild is natural processes, 100%, human influence as close to 0% as we can get,
Okay,
right?
that makes more sense.
So in that
So
way-
let nature just run its course. with
Exactly,
nature.
right? Nature is already managing the west slope different than the east slope because it's just wetter on the west slope and drier on the east slope, right? In North
Correct.
America. So that's kind of the answer to your question. Nature is doing the compartmentalization based on aspect, based on slope, based on proximity to open water bodies, stuff like that.
So that's when you fall under nature reclaiming nature kind of shit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, really.
But what this is saying, what you meant it, what I'm understanding this as is that in a wilderness area, there's not districts. So you're not managing one side of the wilderness area different from the other.
Yeah.
In an example would be a national forest as a whole, it's huge, big, but those are broken up into districts.
Yeah.
And each district has its own management
Right.
goals and sets.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So when we go to Acadia National Park, it's basically 3 units. There's Mount Desert Island, 75,000 acres, 4.5 million people a year, and all jammed into that space in 6 months. It's a busy place. And then there's the Schoodic Peninsula, an hour and a half up the coast. You get off the island, drive, and drop onto the peninsula. It's a little Navy base. sort of like early Cold War, World War II vintage. They were looking for German subs along the East Coast and stuff like that. Anyway, that's another unit, and it's physically separated, and it's a landmass instead of an island. So necessarily, and it gets a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the visitation that Mount Desert Island does.
Right, because it's, I'm assuming.
So you got to manage them completely differently. As separate units, it makes logical sense. Whereas in a wilderness area, the use level is generally pretty low. And since we're managing the whole thing as a unit, we're not going to split out use management into sort of really different policies like Acadia has to be managed for. The third compartment or unit of Acadia National Park is another island, but it's further out into the ocean, and very few people go there. You have to take a special ferry and get reservations and all this stuff, and it's a day use only place. There's no camping, there's no lodging for the public. So Acadia is too heterogeneous and too small to have wilderness, and it's way too developed. There's like 24 small towns on that 75,000 acre island. Like it's a settled place, and it has been for hundreds of years. So that sort of answers the question. There's never going to be a wilderness area federally designated at Acadia National Park because we can't check this box. It's so heterogeneous, it's so varied. All right, principle 3, we want to manage to non-degradation. That is another decision fatigue remover. So if any of your current use or policies, so use from the visitor side, policies and actions from the management side, if that is leading to invasive propagation or destructive wildfires or anything like that, you're stopping that, right? And you don't have a ton of choice in this, and that's a good thing. So some of these decisions to cut off degradation in a wilderness area might be pretty unpopular because it may have to be a pretty heavy-handed cut for something that's been, pretty well loved for a long time in a certain place. There's a tradition of it, local families, this is what they've been doing for generations and stuff like that. And so traditional uses, hunting, primitive style fishing and stuff like that, that's all fine in wilderness, all right?
It's the balance system that we're balancing itself out.
Exactly, but the traditional forms of hunting and stuff like that, they're so lightweight on the land, relatively speaking, that it's not going to cause big degradation or anything like that. So anything else, like mountain biking, which, is a pretty different thing, right? Mountain bikes can move so fast and can take people so far into wilderness so quietly, in contrast to internal combustion engine recreational off-highway vehicles.
And lightly, not doing damage to the soil. I think that's what you meant to. Right?
Not doing much damage to the soil, right? Those rolling wheels don't do much at all, except in sharp turns where those knobby tires shred the soil and throw it to the outside of the curve. But the degradation can happen with wildlife, right? You can rock up on somebody in your 29er Specialized at 20 miles an hour and just flip the fuck out of an entire herd of elk or bison or something like that. And that's degradation. So, mountain bikes aren't allowed anyway, but this would be one way to sort of explain to the public, look, our hands are tied as foresters on this. This is kind of doing the PR work for you.
Right.
We have to preserve this first. And any uses that are compatible with that preservation, we might be able to let those in if they're not mechanized. Anything that isn't compatible with preservation against degradation, we're not even allowed to make that choice. So, yeah, question.
What about in Texas where they're having the overall, I wrote about this, and that's what I know about this, like the invasive feral hog problem where it's doing certain damage to like historical monuments and stuff. Like,
Yep.
Is that what a special circumstance would come in where they're like, go get the SOBs?
Yeah, we'll get to that with a future, one of the later on principles. There's about a dozen of them.
Sorry to ask that question, but I figured like.
No, that's a legit question. What do you do with feral hogs? Because they are extremely destructive. They're mobile, they're intelligent, and they reproduce pretty well.
I call them roaming gypsies.
They are.
Yeah,
They're
They're
roaming
alive.
gypsies.
yeah. Like I've had to,
Tell me about it. I gotta shoot them.
I've had to carry protection doing fieldwork surveying trails because the Park Service staff at Ozark Riverways was like, hey guys, we have some feral hog and some feral horse problems here, and either one of those will
Kill you.
fuck you up pretty
Yeah.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you need to be aware of that. Don't be face down in your GPS.
Yeah.
So the answer there is, yeah, you do take care of it because that's a degradation.
Okay.
And those feral hogs are only there because humans let them get out.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
they didn't put them expressly like there. But
well,
they got
but
out.
they, yeah, exactly. We brought them, and so forth. So that answers that question. Managed to non-degradation. Those feral hogs are human introduced, and they are ripping the heck out of the area. So we're gonna fix the glitch, as they say in Office Space. All right, 4. Manage human influences. You have feral hogs? Deal with it, right? We're gonna have to deal with it in a certain way, but you're definitely dealing with it, right? So that question is answered.
Same with fires, I'm assuming in California with that, or even Canada.
And this principle is how we adjust and update, not change, but modernize the original understanding out of the Wilderness Act for all the new stuff, right? So wilderness managers are having to contend with the last 2 models of iPhones has satellite communications, like we were talking about in class the other day. So that changes how we approach search and rescue, right? We have more timely information, potentially, from people, hikers, wilderness backpackers in distress. And
No, that
our
they got
wilderness
the route.
areas, among all of our land management areas, are most likely to have 0 cell phone coverage and to rely on something like that. So when a technological change happens, we engage with that, and we're also watching it sort of dispassionately to figure out, okay, how does this change the game? When people have safety mechanisms or safety systems in place, you go harder. This is a long-running identified thing with bicycle helmets. People ride in more risky areas and more risky ways. They get way more aggro on downhill mountain biking when they have full body protection, stuff like that. So when any kind of innovation happens, we're asking, okay, how does that multiply or extend or change the character of human influence, right? So people going into a wilderness, maybe they take a riskier trip because they think, oh, my iPhone's gonna save me, right?
So along those same lines, I know the National Park Service is considering removing all fixed bolts for climbing. Would that kind of go along those same lines? I know it's not like a wilderness area, but in terms of
Same
like
idea,
when
though,
you
yeah.
have like in-place protection,
Mm-hmm.
those routes are gonna get a lot more
Riskier people.
activity
Oh, yeah.
on them, and
Yeah.
people are going to flock to those areas. Because I know, like I do, I don't have trad gear, so if I climb outside, I typically find bolted routes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most people do
And
these days. Yeah.
I know in like the Park Service that would, I feel like that kind of goes against Park Service management.
You're gosh darn right it does. Oh, they are so pissed off.
They're so bad.
There's I don't even know how many thousands of spots, different climbing routes and stuff where, people are top roping down a mesa or something like that. And, when they pull the rope release to drop the rope down at the bottom when they're done, that rope is sawing,
Yeah,
it's
it's
chainsawing, rope sawing
Yeah.
down into the sandstone. A, it's ruining the rope, and B, it's
Fucking up thousands of years
Yeah.
of history right there.
yeah, right. That's a permanent modification, and so the Park Service has to have 0 chill about that.
And another thing too.
And so, like drilling the holes for sport bolts, that's a temporary safety fix in the view of the wall, right, which is millions and millions of years old. And that sport bolt's got a life, it's got a lifespan. It's gonna get pulled out at some
That's what I
point
was about to say, because
after metal
the
fatigue.
next thing too is like some people, like when you're top roping, and you're obviously going up and down on the rope a lot.
Uh-huh.
A lot of people, and you shouldn't do this. You should always use your own gear, but it happens more often than you think. A lot of people will climb the route or run their rope through the anchor system or the bolts that you anchor into, top rope right off of those bolts, and the rope does the same thing to the metal bolts that it does to the rock face over time.
It's because people are dumb and don't think.
Exactly,
Yeah.
so like that rope is over time sawing through those bolts, which is gonna force them to be replaced.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that means that they could be forced to drill new holes.
Well, no, why would you?
They will. No, that's a one-way road. And so there's a couple of voices in the climbing community trying to wrestle with this. Like, you know, when it comes time to essentially jackhammer our epoxy and this busted bolt out, or this fatigued bolt, you know, can we work out some kind of arrangement where we put in, color and texture matched epoxy to not fix the problem we can't, but at least hide it a little bit better, right? So where the Park Service can allow rock climbing, and it's typically trad climbing, it's got to be color matched chalk usually, right? Because that patch of white chalk is a huge, huge stimulus for other people to go, oh, that's a climbing route, let's go send it,
Like in Zion,
Yeah,
when we were down in Hendee,
yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking of, yeah.
I was
we
thinking,
found,
they destroyed that.
like me and Sam obviously were looking, but I have pictures of gear left on the walls in Zion, clipped into a sport bolt in Zion.
Yep.
Like not even like in the Zion area, it was like we were just off of the tram system in the like main line gully of the valley.
Like down in the canyon,
Yeah,
not like
and
off
we
kind of
were
at the
like-
edge,
It
yeah.
was like basically we were outside of like a visitor's station.
Mhm.
There's just like abandoned gear that I'm assuming probably somebody left on a retreat on the route. They were like, oh dang, I can't do this, or something happened. They had to retreat. That's
Uh-huh.
typically what gear's left like that. But
Yep.
like, just full blown right there, and it was clipped into a bolt.
So
Like,
what do
I
they
have
do?
the picture.
Yeah, so what do they, send me that picture first. And second, there are a couple of things that might be belying. So first, it may be an active climb, unless the gear was obviously shredded and had been there a long time. It may still be an active climb. The Park Service does permit climbing in there. And, if a particular outfitter and climbing guide, has to leave a bunch of stuff there to, extricate a client and get them to medical care for taking a bad whipper or something, then that's okay. Since the whole thing is permitted, the
this
Park
is
Service
like-
knows who did
this
it,
is
and they
like-
can bill that person for the cost of extracting that ruined gear.
There's actually a few. I have a few pictures of this rig gear, but
Yeah,
it's
send 'em
like,
all.
It's like well used abandoned slings clipped into bolts.
Yeah.
See, that's just assholeness.
Yeah.
I'm more thinking about Camelback. I used to be out in Arizona. I remember when the guys actually
And
started
here's another
drilling
one.
on Camelback.
Yeah.
I'm pissed off all this. See, that's the shit.
Yeah.
And so that's okay. In
that was
some
like-
cases,
that was way
they're
funny.
comfortable leaving the gear up so that everybody can use it. Hey, welcome. All right.
Hi, I'm John. How are you?
Yeah,
Nice to meet you, buddy.
And in some cases, it's somebody who's left it behind, and so it's essentially the ranger team's, it's not their fault, but it's their problem, and they gotta,
Okay.
get a high-angle rescue crew up there to cut the gear out. But that's not particularly uncommon, right? So that's okay. All right. Principle 5, we want to manage biocentrically to provide human values which will provide human benefits, right? So we're not primarily managing for the climbers. We're not managing for the hikers. We're managing for the cliff and the cliff edge and cliff face, plant and animal communities. And to the extent that that cliff is awesome for climbing, hey, that's great, but that's not the point here, right? So this is different. This is a huge difference versus the Park Service's like raison d'etre, the reason they exist. They want to preserve the natural resources of the United States, and they want to provide extreme high quality access and opportunity to enjoy those resources and benefit from them, right? So there's this clear management balance and trade-off happening in national parks, which are also managed through preservation, but not wilderness preservation standards. Here, the biocentrism takes precedence, period. Because it has to be wild.
Sir, I feel like he was Big Lebowski right there for a
It's
second.
got to be at the pristine extreme. Okay? So, that's a big one. And there's a lot to discuss in the finer texture of human values and benefits and stuff like that. But basically, you know, if we have the rule of thumb here, all the rest of that just kind of flows with it, right? So, manage biocentrically, and whatever that looks like is what the human uses of it are going to have to be fitted to. We're not fitting the ecosystem health or structure or function. We're not balancing it. We're just not going to bother that. So, the next principle, 6, kind of flows from this. We could put it like under 5, but for looking closer at human uses, we can filter pretty aggressively on the wilderness dependent stuff. Like if you can do something elsewhere, go do it elsewhere, right? We got more paved trails, we've got more visitor centers and flush toilets. We can handle you better elsewhere. And that's gonna leave space for the things that you can really only access in wilderness. And that's okay, right? So this is an exclusionary management principle, which is weird because usually management is trying to optimize for maximum inclusion of profit, maximum inclusion of visitor services, maximum inclusion of ecosystem structure and function, right? This one we're cutting a lot of stuff out on purpose so that we can do better with a much shorter list of human uses and activities. So, seven. Do your management plans. This is kind of a clarification and a hedge on people getting out of control with this one. So, we're managing wilderness comprehensively as an integral unit, as one big set or collection of ecosystems. But we may need to acknowledge or realize or work towards this idea that, okay, so we got at Denali, the Alaska Range, it's not really an east-west slope system, it's more north-south, but okay, so in Colorado, Front Range, right, straight north-south, mountain range running, so we have clear west-facing slopes, clear east-facing slopes. To the extent that you got both of those in a wilderness setting, we're gonna run that wilderness as that integral unit, but the human uses on it are gonna have differing levels of impact and degradation, principle 3. So we wanna manage the hiking on the west-facing slopes differently than the hiking on the east-facing slopes. Make sense?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so the ecosystems, the physical resources, manage as a unit, manage as a system, manage it integrally. Be more specific, sharpen the pencil a lot on managing the human uses relative to the more sort of variegated patchwork landscape inside of that. So specific area objectives would be the language for that. Another way to kind of nuance this a little bit better for the human impact, human presence, human uses side of stuff. Treat us like wildlife. So, we want to understand that this sort of total laser focus we have on managing biocentrically, managing for preservation and pristine level of preservation, like literally the extreme end of the spectrum. That's gonna put a hard ceiling on how many people can walk down a certain trail before the wildlife around that trail, the water bodies down slope of that trail, on down the list. All the different impact dynamics we talked about in park management last semester. That carrying capacity now matters more because we don't have any room for degradation. If we drop below 100% quality, it's too much of a drop. So that's going to be a typically pretty low number, and it's going to be a site-specific or area-specific number, like, a dry, hot west slope, probably pretty stable, dried-out soils most of the time. Especially a hot, sunny south slope, pretty good, Maybe run your wilderness trails through that section. For a west-facing slope that's, rainy, plenty of sun, but lots of rain, we're looking at some mud and some precip impacts. So, that's going to have a super low carrying capacity during whatever the rainy season is for that particular set of ecosystems, whatever the climate regime is. And so it doesn't have to be a blunt instrument. We can have different carrying capacities for different times of year, for high rain years, for low rain years, for cicada years. This year is the big overlap on all the cicadas here in parts of Illinois. Yeah. Was it 17 and 26 or 23 year broods, whatever it is? Pretty exciting stuff. These use limits back in the 60s and 70s when this was first getting started didn't matter because it was such a new thing. Most of the wilderness areas were the core interior habitats of, most of our big national forests and parks and stuff, and the use just wasn't there. These days, post-COVID with, double and triple visitation at some of these parks these last couple of years, yeah, we're hitting some of these ceilings, and, people don't have to be excited about that, but they still need to respect it because we don't have any wiggle room on environmental degradation in wilderness areas. So that's a thing. And since a lot of us in government work, and most all of the big wilderness areas are government run, of course, run publicly. Since some of us in the Forest Service and the Park Service and stuff, we want to have our management legacy, like the trail named after us or something like that. This next principle is kind of a hedge against us being overachievers on management, or at least modifying the area as a part of management. So, I'm going to focus the on-site management. We talked about on-site versus off-site management at the beginning of the semester, how they're pretty different things. We're not doing large-scale land management unless we have to in a wilderness area. We're not doing treatments that affect or modify the whole thing unless it's to bring it back to a totally wild, restored ecosystem character. Instead, we're going to focus most all of our on-site management onto impacted sites. And typically, initially that's going to be sites that are old homesteads, farmsteads, mine heads, boat landings, old roads, old trails, stuff like that, like historic land use that needs to sort of eventually go away naturally or be removed. And then later on, after that, most of that work is done, it's basically down to just kind of maintaining trails and closing down visitor-created campsites to the extent that those sites tend to grow and kind of metastasize like a cancer a lot more than Forest Service or Park Service like designed, installed, maintained sites, If somebody's just throwing down a tent and then other people see it later on, those are the sites that just grow and grow and grow. So that's another decision fatigue removing kind of a thing. Like, all right, we're not going to do a ton of TSI style things, because we can't improve on wild. There's no stand improvement to be done. It's just letting it return to nature mostly and doing restoration actively if we have to. But since we're using minimum tools, I mean, how many centuries is it going to take to do hand pulling of weeds across the entire Shawnee if the entire Shawnee was a wilderness area, right? I mean, that's a legitimate time-scale question. How many centuries would that take if hand pulling is all you get to do? And, practically speaking, that's never going to happen, right? So we don't worry about that.
Are there passive methods to keeping, like, the number of visitors of a trail down? Like,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a great question. So, passive methods of keeping number of visitors on a trail down. First, you don't make an easy trail, right? That's not a wild experience. Second, you don't advertise it. People don't go where they don't know, for the most part, right? There's going to be that tiny minority of folks who they get that itch and they set out with a truck and their dog and they're going to go find some trail that very few people ever step foot on. Third, you limit the size of the access. So you make the trailhead not have a big, sign with information and stuff like that that's noticeable from 500 yards away off the highway. You relocate that section of trail so it's just around the bend, and 100% of people drive by and a fraction of a percent of people think about the trailhead.
kind of like advertise the trails that you want people to focus on or use the most.
Yeah.
And the ones that are the most vulnerable, just have it available with a small parking lot.
Exactly. And people will find that still. So when we go to Acadia for summer camp this year, we'll go to the quiet side of the island as well, where there's just as many trails on the quiet side of the island, and they see like a fraction of a percent of the use, some of them, that the most busy trails do, because the Park Service maintains it. They're all beautiful. They all have the nice parking lots and all that stuff, but they just don't say anything about it.
For a reason, because they
Yeah.
let certain people go in certain areas, and
Yeah.
they like you're more nature, like you enjoy this side more. It's not like they're advertising it, but it's like through word of mouth. Like
Yeah.
the rangers will tell one of the group of people,
Yeah.
and they'll keep it small or some shit. Because I remember them doing that. For like there's hidden gems all over, especially like in Washington.
Exactly.
Washington, D.C., like
Yes.
they'll direct certain people to those places. And
Every
other
park,
places.
every forest is chock full of those hidden gems. And, generally speaking, Forest Service, Park Service, they're not trying to hide them. They're just not saying anything. They're just being low-key about it. So that's a hiding in plain sight management strategy, and that's exactly how it's used and why it's used. So I'm gonna round out our list here. Minimum tool, presence, force applied. So this is nuancing that minimum tool rule we were talking about.
There's the
Yeah, where
we can't bring the chainsaws in or the
yeah,
hand saws.
if a one-man bucksaw will clear the trail, then the chainsaw's not allowed, right? If you absolutely have to use a chainsaw in an emergency situation, you strap the chainsaw on the back of the ATV and you get in there and you get the person out, get the person in distress out, for example. Or you land the helicopter in there, right? Helicopter is totally forbidden in wilderness except when it is the minimum tool to accomplish that emergency job. Not a big deal. So it's not a stupid rule. It's not a mindless restriction. It's, use your brain. If we can do this with sweat equity and bare hands, then we will. And that'll be a nice way to actually accomplish this. When you gotta clear and maintain trails by hand, or maybe it's, you solo with your pack mule for 6-8 weeks at a time out there in the backcountry maintaining trail, and Checking in with dispatch a couple of times a week, helping out with search and rescue and stuff like that. Like, that's about all you can manage, right? Just walking the trail and fixing particular problem sites, blowouts, big muddy spots that are leading to sedimentation and stream scour, downslope, that sort of thing. And that's a great way to let yourself off the hook for, jumping in, like young buck, ready to go. Hey, I'm a new Forest Service employee. I'm ready to, kick some ass and take some names on this wilderness area.
Slow down there, partner. We got it.
Yeah, you spend a couple of seasons like being the one-man trail crew for a 100,000-acre area, and it's like, okay, I'm good. Like I fixed one campsite today, and yeah, I'm pretty proud of that. Like I understand how much work that took, and that kept me from building 5 more campsites with a dingo or skid steer and just feature creeping, eroding the wildness of it. We stay busy with the basics and we're good. That's explicitly a good thing with the minimum tool rule. So, then the last couple are mostly outside the scope of this class, so we'll just mention them. Involve the public. If you guys took Kofi's planning class, you know all about NEPA, right? This is a legal requirement and all that stuff, but yeah, like ask folks, did it feel pretty wild out there? Or are we working a little bit too hard and we need to kind of pump the brakes on us a little bit? Did you guys see any non-native invasive species out there? You guys be our eyes and ears because we're busy hand building trail, stuff like that. Like it doesn't have to be, all right, we're gonna have this open forum and we'll have free coffee for everybody and you come bitch at us about, your shitty neighbor and stuff like that, and we'll be like, sir, this is a Wendy's. Oh my God, town halls, man.
Yep.
Like it's funny because it's like, yeah, I could see this happening. It's not totally outlandish.
That was exactly
Oh,
what she
God.
was. He's telling that whole fucking thing right there.
So yeah, basically, don't be so busy holed up on the trail or in your management office, in particular, offsite, is where a lot of this is going to be an issue. Talk to your people, right? Like, be involved, be present, and make a meaningful communication. Not just like, yeah, we opened up the comment period and we round filed all the postcards we got, round filed from the trail. And then monitor. Monitor conditions physically, ecologically. All the stuff of forest measurements, all the stuff of park management. We'll practice some techniques in this class for mostly analog style trail and campsite monitoring stuff that is more minimum tool aligned than the stuff that we practiced in park management last semester. Okay, so there you go. That's kind of the main stuff. There are a couple others. Now let's fit it in. No, this is a good one. Management wilderness in relation to management of adjacent lands. All right, so we're managing this as a unit, and we are acknowledging, we got up to hundreds of miles of fence line around this thing, or in a lot of cases no fence line, but perimeter. And if our neighbor is allowing non-native invasive weeds to get in there, then okay, we can't ignore that. So let's at least talk with them. Let's do interagency fire management outside of our wilderness area so that we can manage the fire in and around our wilderness effectively. So manage broader landscape, which is a super vague thing to say, but I think we kind of get the idea, right? None of this stuff is in isolation ever. All right, those Those are our 13 management principles. Again, this is a superset on top of the Wilderness Act, and this positions us to get into more of the interesting stuff instead of talking in class. On-site tools, tactics, and like the day-to-day management stuff of wilderness. Sound good? Cool. There you go. All right.